So Git hooks, let's talk about some practical uses, what they are, what you can do, and how you can even get them to work on Windows. So let's get, first of all, a quick overview. What are Git hooks? Well, Git hooks allow you to run custom scripts whenever certain important events occur within the Git lifecycle, such as committing, merging, and pushing. So for instance, Git is about to commit something. You can write a script that hooks in to that commit and can possibly prevent the commit from happening based on certain criteria. Or you could even respond to that event and maybe fire off some email based on that commit. Anything that you want to do, you can do if you can script it. So that's a really brief high-level overview of what Git hooks are. But now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So for instance here, I've got this directory, my repo, and it's a brand new directory, just did a git init on it. So you'll notice that what do I have? Nothing except for a little .git folder. So if we cd into that, and inside of this folder you have your basic bare bones Git stuff, and here's another directory called hooks. And this comes for free, cd to hooks, and let's check him out and look. These are some sample Git hooks that come when you first init a Git repo. So you notice that all of them have this .sample extension, and that means that by default they're not enabled, they're not going to run. If you want these to run, you have to remove that .sample extension and also make them executable. So like we mentioned, this comes from a bare repo template on init. Where is that? Well, if you're on Linux, it's in user share git core templates. And so whenever you run git init, create a new repo, it's going to copy this stuff from templates into that new repo. So if that's where the magic is happening, if you're wondering where in the world do these samples come from, it's there. Windows, it's basically the same with that extension, share git core templates, except with the program file stuff before it. Now you'll notice if we go back to looking at those hooks, they're well named. You can pretty much tell what they do just by looking at them. Some of them have that prefix, like pre-commit, that indicates that the hook, the script that you write, is going to run before that event happens, giving you the opportunity to perhaps prevent that event from happening. Maybe you don't like the white space formatting. Maybe you don't like your username. You want to set it to make sure it's set to something. Otherwise, you want to fail that commit. Well, you can do that with something like a pre-hook. Post usually means, well, I think it always means, you can't actually prevent the thing from happening because it done happened, but you can respond to that event. Now, 0 equals hero. What do we mean? Well, since these are scripts, that means that if the script exits with a 0, that means it succeeded. If it exits with any other number, that means it failed. For instance, if we look at that default pre-commit there, and you'll notice that it has an example here for the sample hook. It says that if somebody tries to add a non-ASCII file name and then commit that, it's going to throw an error and exit with a 1 code instead of a 0. So what that's going to do is Git is going to say, well, your script exited with a 1. I'm going to fail the commit and not continue. Also, our hooks can be local or server-side. So if you're running a Git server, you might be able to do things like prevent people from pushing if the commit doesn't meet certain criteria. You could run a linter on it. I don't know, anything that you want to do. And also, as we saw, all of these hooks are disabled by default because they have that .sample. They're not going to run. You have to remove the .sample, and you also have to make these hooks executable. On Linux, that's as easy as running a chmod +x and then run that on your hook. It's not usually an issue on Windows. Most of the files are already executable. If they're not, you can just look into the security properties and make sure that you have the rights to execute that hook. Okay, what about a few Git hooks and gotchas? Well, for one, they introduce surprises potentially in your Git workflow. So if people are expecting Git to work in a certain way, and then you go and put on all these hooks, then they could get surprised and confused and wonder what in the world is going on. So you just want to keep that in mind, not make it too weird or surprising for people. Also remember that Git hooks are not checked into source control. You look at your .git hooks directory, that's not going to get saved in source control. You can't, that's not going to get committed when you commit. So if you write a whole bunch of really fancy scripts and you're super excited, and then one day you just delete this directory and reclone it somewhere, you're not going to get those hooks back. So that could be a big gotcha, especially if you're relying, say, on pre-commit or pre-push hooks to keep you out of trouble, and then suddenly that safety net is gone. That can be a big issue, so be careful with that. One workaround, if you do want to commit these to source control, is sometimes people will say copy the hooks directory, maybe put it in the root of their repo, like my repo hooks, and then they can use symlinks to link the files in .git hooks to that directory. So that might be a workaround you can use. Another thing to keep in mind is that Git hooks are easily bypassed locally. If you're running on your own machine, and if you're running, say, a pre-commit hook, if you want to bypass that from happening, all you got to do is add that no verify, and then it's not going to happen. Also, sometimes the way Git hooks fail can be irritating. Sometimes they'll tell you, other times when things aren't set up right, like when you're trying to get it working on Windows, it just fails. You're like, why is my hook not running? But you really have no clue because there's no error message anywhere. Maybe there's a log I just haven't found, but that can be irritating and table flip inducing. So just keep that in mind. Well, let's get practical with Git hooks. Is there anything interesting, fun that you can do? Well, let's take a look. What about setting your correct name and email? Has that ever happened to you, especially if you work on a lot of different projects and maybe you have a different email that you use with each one, and then you clone a new repo or init a new repo, and then you forget to change your email, and then you go pushing it to a public repo somewhere, and there's like your personal email address. That can be irritating. So maybe you'd like to stop that with a pre-commit hook. Well, let's take a look at an example. So there's an example where I took the default pre-commit.sample, removed that .sample, made it executable, and then added a few of my own stuff. But here's the interesting bits that I was talking about. So make sure my email is set properly. So here we get the email address that's set in this repo, and then we simply, this is an SH script, so it's pretty basic. But if the user email that we retrieved is unequal to this email, then we're gonna cat out this error and exit with 1. Remember, that means that it's going to fail. So if we try to commit, it's not going to work. Same with my name. If my name is not set correctly, if it's not Ty Walls, maybe for one project I go by Rumpelstiltskin or Neo or something like that, then I make sure I'm nice and professional and I put my Ty Walls back in there and exit with a 1 if that's not what it's set to. So this actually has gotten me out of trouble in a few cases. Some other fun stuff you might be able to do is if there's certain words that are present in a diff, word 1, ooh man, you wouldn't want to commit word 1 to the repo. So if that's in there, then you can say, oh, these words from the blacklist were present, and you can exit with a 1. So that's just a kind of a silly example I threw in there, but it's definitely possible. Okay, so let's demo this. Let's see if our pre-commit hook will prevent us from committing if our name and email is incorrect. So here we are in the repo, and let's create a new file. And after we create that file, let's go ahead and add him. And then we're going to try to commit. Let's see what happens. Ooh, and look at that. Our pre-commit hook caught it. It says user.email was not set to the right email address. So you say, oh, wow, whew, thank you, Git hook. Thanks for saving me. Let me go ahead and set that. Git config user.email. And we'll try again. Oops. Oh, and look at that. The other portion of our script saved us from having the wrong username. So we go ahead, we set the user.name. Sorry, that G is just an alias for Git, just so I don't have to type as much. So git config user.name, set that to our Ty Walls like it's expecting. And we'll try to commit again. And look at that. It worked. Our pre-commit script ran, but it was successful, returned that 0, and everything was happy. Here's a note about pre-commit versus pre-push. When would you want to choose one over the other? Well, it depends on what your goals are. For something like this, choosing your name or your email, I'm guessing you probably want to do it on pre-commit, right? Because if you do it on pre-push only, and by that time you've already committed who knows how many commits using that wrong email. And now you're going to have to go back to rewriting history, changing your name, changing your email, amending those commits, and that would be irritating. So for something like that, you would probably want to do it with a pre-commit. A pre-push, that's something I've done to check whether or not my build is still passing before I push. Because how horrible would that be is if you do all this work and you push it to the remote repository and you break the build. Then you'll feel like really terrible, a real heel. So an interesting thing about this too is Git doesn't care what scripting language that you use. All it cares about is that return status. Are you returning a 0? Yay! Or a 1 or some other number, then it's going to fail. So that means the sky's the limit as far as which scripting languages you use. So for instance, if we edited that pre-commit hook and we changed this to be a bash, it would still work. If you have some other, Ruby, you could use that if you're more comfortable writing in that, and it would work just fine. It's pretty cool, right? It's all about the shebang line there at the very beginning, that first line of the script. So what about Windows? Yeah, what about Windows? Windows can be an annoying place to work for getting your hooks working correctly. And a lot of it has to do with that shebang line. And one hack that I've used in the past with some success, it really depends. I haven't pinned down why it always works or it doesn't work, but sometimes you can separate the two paths, bin sh, semicolon, and then the path that works on Windows, and it works on both machines, but then other times it doesn't. So it's not something I can really recommend for production. It's a hack you might try in your case. If you are only on Windows, just leave off this first part. All you need is the C, program files, Git, just basically the path to sh or whichever scripting language you're planning on using. And as long as it can find that and run that executable, it'll be able to run everything else. The cool thing about that too is it also means you might be able to just run a PowerShell script and do a lot on Windows. So that's how you can get your scripts to run in Windows. Now we talked about deploying your hooks a little bit, right? And how they're not checked into source control by default. You have to roll that on your own. But in version 2.9, they added this feature where you can actually set hooks path, core.hooks path. And then what that does is that allows you potentially to set a global directory for hooks on your local box. So for instance, with my pre-commit hook, if I want that to run for every repo by default, I can set hooks path, for instance, like this. So if I can say git config, core.hooks path, and I can say run this on my banana hooks path. And then what it's going to do, sorry, to actually only set that for this repo, but to set it globally, I would need the -- global. Now that's going to, for every repo on this local box, it's going to look in banana hooks path for my git hooks. So that's pretty cool, very useful. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching. You can check me out on Twitter at TigerTech or the website tigertech.com, and of course please subscribe. Thanks for watching.